The year was 1887, and the land itself held its breath, caught between the sharp, unforgiving edges of civilization and the vast, whispering emptiness of the plains. Nathaniel lived in this in-between space, a boy of 12 years who belonged to neither world. He was a ghost in the dusty streets of Prairie Ridge, a settlement that clung to the earth like a burr on a saddle blanket, and he was a shadow at the edge of the sprawling Cheyenne territory, a place of which he knew nothing but fearful whispers and the sight of distant smoke signals that painted questions against the bruised blue sky. His existence was a threadbare thing, woven from solitude and survival. He was an orphan, a fact the townspeople recited with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They saw a boy with hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes the gray of a gathering storm. But there was something in the line of his jaw and the quiet intensity of his gaze that didn't quite belong to their world of clapboard and scripture. He was a puzzle they had no interest in solving, so they left him to the fringes, to the ramshackle lean-to behind the livery stable, where the smell of hay and manure was the only constant companion. Nathaniel's days were a silent routine of necessity. He mucked out stalls for scraps of bread. He patched worn leather for a dented can of beans. He watched. He was a prodigious watcher. He watched the stern-faced women of the town, their skirts sweeping the dust, their gazes sliding right over him, as if he were no more than a stray dog. He watched the men, their voices loud and their certainty louder, as they spoke of savages and progress. And he watched the land, the way the wind combed through the tall grass, making it sigh like a sleeping giant, the way hawks drew lazy circles in the infinite sky. He carried a loneliness so profound it had weight, settling in his bones like the winter cold. He had no memory of a mother's touch, only a single, precious keepsake, a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched, worn smooth by the constant, unconscious rub of his thumb. His father was a void, a question he'd long ago learned not to ask. To be fatherless was to be rootless, a tumbleweed at the mercy of every gust of wind. His life was a long, quiet hum of resignation, a stasis of the heart where hope was a currency too expensive to afford. One afternoon, driven by a hunger that gnawed deeper than usual, Nathaniel ventured farther than he ever had before. He followed a dry creek bed, his eyes scanning the ground for anything edible: roots, late-season berries, a rabbit's nest. The air grew still, the familiar sounds of the town fading behind him until there was only the buzz of insects and the rustle of unseen things in the brush. He was deep into the borderlands, the contested space where the world of Prairie Ridge bled into the world of the Cheyenne. It was the unnatural silence that first alerted him, not the peaceful quiet of an empty land, but a taut, listening silence, as if the very air was waiting for something to break. Then he saw it. A horse, its coat the color of dried blood, lay on its side, its great chest still. Pinned beneath its weight was a man. Nathaniel froze, his heart seizing in his chest. He was a Cheyenne warrior. There was no mistaking the intricate beadwork on his leather vest, the single eagle feather tied into his long, dark hair, the formidable presence he held even in ruin. He was grievously wounded, a dark stain spreading across his deerskin leggings from the crushing weight of the animal. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of stoic pain. A tremor of fear, raw and primal, shot through Nathaniel. Everything he'd ever heard screamed at him to run. The townspeople spoke of the Cheyenne as specters of violence, their cruelty, a legend told to frighten children into obedience. To be found here with this man could mean a lashing, or worse. Yet his feet remained planted in the dusty soil. He saw not a monster from a campfire story, but a man, broken and dying, alone under the vast, indifferent sky. The warrior's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep-set, and filled with an agony that transcended language. They found Nathaniel, and for a long moment the world shrank to the space between the frightened orphan and the fallen warrior. There was no menace in the man's gaze, only a flicker of something that looked like surprise, followed by a profound, heart-wrenching weariness. He had reached the end of his trail. This was the moment Nathaniel's life fractured. The monotonous hum of his existence was shattered by a choice. He could flee back to the familiar misery of his life, leaving this man to the vultures and the sun, or he could stay. He could act. The warrior's lips parted, a dry, rasping sound escaping. It might have been a word, or just a breath of pain. Nathaniel did not know. He only knew he could not leave. Slowly, cautiously, he crept forward. He unslung the small water skin from his shoulder half filled, and Preciosen knelt beside the warrior. He lifted the man's head with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, and dribbled a few drops of water onto his cracked lips. The man swallowed with difficulty, a faint sigh rattling in his chest. His eyes closed again, but this time, some of the tension seemed to have eased from his face. Nathaniel stayed. He sat on the sun-baked earth, a silent sentinel, as the afternoon bled into a sky bruised with the purples and oranges of sunset. He watched the warrior's breathing grow shallower, each breath a struggle. He felt a strange and powerful connection to this stranger, a sense of shared solitude in the face of an overwhelming wilderness. In the man's impending death, Nathaniel saw a reflection of his own isolation. They were both alone out here. As twilight deepened, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, the warrior's chest rose one last time, and then was still. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the dead horse, heavier than the gathering night. Nathaniel was alone again, but something had changed. The loneliness was no longer just his own. He now carried the weight of this man's, too. He spent the night there, huddled against the chill, his hand resting on the warrior's cold arm. He kept watch, his fear of the dark and its creatures eclipsed by a fierce, inexplicable need to protect this man's body, to guard his dignity in death. He felt a grief that was bewildering in its intensity. It was a hollow ache in his chest, a sorrow for a life he had not known, for a story he would never hear. Why did this stranger's passing feel like a personal loss? When the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, a resolve had hardened within him. He couldn't leave him here. The townspeople, if they found him, would desecrate the body, treat it as a trophy or an object of contempt, and he did not know how to alert the man's tribe. The thought of approaching their camp filled him with a paralyzing terror. He was caught between two worlds, with a sacred duty that belonged to neither. He would give the warrior a burial. It was the only thing he could do. Using his hands and a flat piece of rock, he began to dig into the hard, unforgiving earth beside the creek bed. The work was grueling, his palms blistering, his muscles screaming in protest. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, beating down on his back. He worked in a trance of grief and determination, his sweat and tears mingling with the dust. He managed a shallow grave, but it was enough. With a strength born of reverence, he worked to free the warrior's body from beneath the horse. He was a man of substance, tall and powerfully built, and it took every ounce of Nathaniel's meager strength to move him. He laid him gently in the grave, folding his hands over his chest. He looked at the man's face, peaceful now in death, and saw not an enemy, but a kind of nobility he had never witnessed before. He saw a strength that was quiet and deep, a face that held the wisdom of the mountains and the sorrow of the plains. But the grave felt incomplete. It needed a marker. It needed something to say that a man of worth lay here, that his passing had not gone unnoticed. In Nathaniel's world, the world that had raised him in its shadow, there was only one symbol for such a thing. A cross. He knew nothing of the Cheyenne's beliefs, of their spirits or their sky burials. He only knew the stark wooden cross that stood in the town's meager cemetery, a symbol of remembrance and honor. He found two sturdy branches of cottonwood, one longer than the other. Using the sharp edge of his digging rock and a length of cord he unraveled from his own trousers, he began to fashion them together. His hands, raw and bleeding, fumbled with the wood. He worked with a frantic intensity, a singular focus that blocked out everything else: his hunger, his exhaustion, his fear. This act was an offering, a bridge built from the only materials he had. It was a son's unknowing tribute, using the language of his captors to honor a father he never knew. As he lashed the final knot, the cross felt solid in his hands. It was rough, imperfect, but it was made with a purity of intent that made it sacred. He drove the base of it into the earth at the head of the grave. It stood stark and lonely against the vast landscape, a strange and solitary monument. His task was done. The physical and emotional toll crashed over him in a great wave. He sank to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. His gaze was fixed on the crude cross, a symbol of one world standing guard over a son of another. He thought he would just rest his eyes for a moment. But sleep, deep and absolute, claimed him like a tide pulling him out to sea. He awoke to silence, not the empty silence of the wilderness, but a thick, living silence, heavy with presence. He opened his eyes, and his blood ran cold. He was surrounded. They stood in a wide, silent circle around the grave, their forms like statues in the soft morning light. There were at least 24 of them, Cheyenne warriors in their full, formidable regalia, their faces painted for mourning, their eyes fixed on the grave. Behind them stood women and elders, their expressions unreadable, etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to carved from the land itself. They hadn't made a sound. They had simply appeared, ghosts of the prairie, to reclaim their own. Terror, sharp and clean, pierced through Nathaniel's exhaustion. This was it. This was the end. They would see the cross, the ultimate symbol of the white man's world that had taken so much from them, and they would see it as a desecration, a final insult. They would see him, the pale-faced boy, and they would exact their vengeance. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could run, but where? There was no escape. He looked at the circle of solemn faces, at the stoic warriors holding spears and bows, and he made a choice. He would not run. He had done this thing, this honor, and he would stand by it. He straightened his small frame, lifted his chin, and stood beside the grave, by his handiwork, ready to face whatever came. He would not cower, not now. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and wisdom, his hair as white as winter frost, stepped forward from the circle. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his gaze not on Nathaniel but on the cross. He was Awoke, an elder of great renown, a keeper of stories. He reached the grave and stopped, studying the roughly hewn wood. His expression was not of anger, but of a profound, searching curiosity. He touched the cross gently with one gnarled finger, as if testing the texture of a foreign idea. Then, his gaze fell upon the still form in the shallow grave. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, a sound of immense loss that seemed to resonate through the silent crowd. The warriors visibly straightened, their grief palpable. Awoke knelt, his ancient knees cracking, and looked upon the face of the dead man for a long time. Finally, he looked up, his dark, piercing eyes finding Nathaniel. The boy held his breath, expecting a curse, a command, a sentence, but the old man's eyes held a question, a deep and sorrowful puzzle. He gestured to another warrior, a tall man with a severe face, who stepped forward and knelt beside the elder. With infinite reverence, the warrior reached for the dead man's neck. He carefully lifted a small leather pouch that was tucked inside the warrior's vest, its thong worn thin with time. Awoke took the pouch. His fingers, surprisingly nimble, worked at the drawstring. He tipped the contents into his palm. A gasp, soft as a whisper, rippled through the onlookers. In the elder's palm lay 2 small items. One was a tiny lock of hair, fine and pale, the color of corn silk. The other was a small, carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched. It was identical to the one in Nathaniel's pocket. Time seemed to stop. The world held its breath. Nathaniel's hand flew to his pocket, his fingers closing around the familiar shape of his own bird. It was the only thing he had of his mother, she who was only a ghost of a memory. He pulled it out, holding it in his trembling palm for them to see. Vokin's gaze shifted from the bird in his hand to the one in Nathaniel's, then to the boy's pale hair, and finally to his storm-grey eyes. Understanding dawned on his ancient face, an expression of such staggering revelation and sorrow that it took Nathaniel's breath away. The pieces of a long-hidden story clicked into place in the silent air between them. The elder rose to his feet and spoke, his voice low and resonant, filled with the gravel of age and the weight of truth. He spoke in the Cheyenne tongue, a language of soft consonants and flowing vowels. The severe-faced warrior beside him, who evidently knew some English from dealings at trading posts, began to translate, his own voice thick with an emotion he struggled to contain. He says, "This man you have honored was Moketavato. He was our chief." The warrior paused, swallowing hard. "He was the greatest of us." Nathaniel's legs felt weak. A chief. He had buried a chief. Vokin spoke again, his eyes never leaving Nathaniel's face. The warrior translated, his voice softer now. "The woman with the sun, hair, your mother, he loved her. She lived in your town. Their love was a secret thing, a bridge between two worlds that both our peoples would have torn down." The story tumbled out, piece by painful piece. Nathaniel's mother, Clara, had died giving birth to him. Moketavato had been heartbroken, lost. He knew his son, a half-blood child, would not be safe. His own enemies within the tribes would see the boy as a weakness, a contamination. And the white townsfolk would never accept the son of a Cheyenne warrior. They would see a monster, not a child. "To protect you," the warrior translated, his voice cracking, "our chief did the hardest thing a father can do. He gave you away." Moketavato had wrapped his infant son in a blanket, placing the small wooden birdamate to the one he had carved for Clara in his hand, and left him on the steps of the Prairie Ridge Church. He had condemned himself to a life of watching his only son grow up from a distance, a stranger. He could never claim him, never teach him, never hold him. He could only watch from the hills, his heart breaking day after day, year after year. Vokin gestured to the cross. He spoke one last time, his voice gentle. He says, "When we found our chief gone, we followed his trail here. We saw this holy symbol of your people, and we prepared for a fight. We thought his body had been shamed." The warrior looked at Nathaniel, his eyes now filled with a dawning awe. "But then we saw you, and we saw the grave you dug, the honor you gave." Vokin says, "A spirit does not know the languages of men. A son's spirit knows his father's spirit. You did not know his name, but your heart knew his heart. You honored him with the only language of respect you have ever been taught." The truth settled over Nathaniel, immense and shattering. The grief he had felt was not for a stranger. It was the primal, instinctual grief of a son for his father. The inexplicable pull, the need to protect, the profound sense of loss, it all made sense. The man in the grave was his father. He looked at the cross, this crude symbol he had made. It was not a sign of division after all. It was a monument to a love that had defied two worlds, a testament to a father's sacrifice and a son's unknowing devotion. The circle of warriors did not part for him, but their stance had changed. The severity was gone, replaced by a shared sorrow and a quiet wonder. They were no longer guarding against an outsider. They were enclosing one of their own. Vokin stepped forward and placed a heavy, comforting hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. The touch was not that of a stranger, but of a grandfather. The vigil they held that day was not just for a fallen chief. It was for a father and his son, reunited only in death. It was a vigil for a secret kept, for a love that had cost everything. As the sun began its descent, they did not take Nathaniel away. They brought him into their circle. They shared their food with him. They spoke his father's name, Moketavato, and told him stories of his courage, his wisdom, his sadness. Nathaniel's loneliness, the constant companion of his entire life, did not just break, it dissolved, turning to mist in the warmth of this new, unbelievable belonging. He was not an orphan. He was not a stray. He was Nathaniel, son of Moketavato. He had a name. He had a people. He had a home. He spent the night wrapped in a warm buffalo robe, sleeping amidst the silent, grieving warriors of the Cheyenne. He was no longer on the fringe, but at the very heart of a family he never knew he had. His past was no longer a void, but a story of sacrifice and profound love. His future, once a bleak and empty horizon, was now a path leading home. The next morning, as they prepared a travois to carry their chief back to their village for his final rites, Nathaniel stood by the empty grave. The rough wooden cross remained, stark against the morning sky. Vokine stood beside him and said through the translator, "You will come with us. You will learn the ways of your father." Nathaniel looked at the cross one last time. It was a strange and beautiful thing, a symbol of everything he had been and everything he was now becoming. It was the bridge his father had tried to build, a bridge he himself had completed without ever knowing it. He was a boy from one world who belonged to another, carrying the legacy of both. And as he turned to follow his people, his father's people, into the heart of the plains, he knew he was finally, truly, walking home.